All right, let's talk about automotive primer. First of all, there's several different primers. Almost every primer has different properties. And I always tell people, look, the first thing you want to do is really dig into the TDS, technical data sheets. They're online on every product. You can look up all the detailed information. Also, what's on the label will help you understand the properties of the primer as well. So we're going to go back in time, talk about the 80s and what kind of primers there were, the problems people had, all the way up to today where, we're going to talk about urethane primer, epoxy primers. We're going to even go back to lacquer primer as well, polyester primers, DTM high build, DTM non-high build urethane. They're all different. Non-DTM primers that are high build. Back in the 80s, there was only two types of primer, and they were polyester primer and there was lacquer primer. Before that, there was probably just lacquer primer. And the good things about them is lacquer primer dried really, really fast, so you could do repairs really quickly. You could sand it off really quickly, and it would do its job. The problems is that it would shrink a lot, and so your finish might come out dull over where your bodywork was, depending on the primer you use. So people would try to make up for that with a sealer coat. I always found out the best way to do it was to sand it down and paint the car twice. I just go through, paint it once, sand it down, paint it again. That got rid of all that. Then came out the polyester primer, which was a really high build. The disadvantages is that at that time we were getting more flexible bumpers. It did not hold up on a flexible bumper. So after that, they came out with a urethane primer. So, but back in the 80s, we used to use polyester primer for high build, and the thing we liked about it is when we painted over it, it wouldn't shrink as much as the old lacquer primers. So a lot of us restoration guys were starting to use the polyester primer, but then we'd have issues sometimes with cracking. One of the reasons people had that problem is what they do is they put too much hardener in the primer. These primers come with one of these. Some guys would put two in, and then of course, you put too much hardener in, it makes it crystallize and crack. So there was that issue, especially on the old PCL product, which is good. There's nothing really wrong with the product. It was just abused a lot. So typically, the lacquer primers were used as a cheap way to do bodywork, and they're still available now. If you're trying to go the cheapest possible, you don't really care if you get 4 or 5 years out of your paint job, and then you use lacquer primer and acrylic enamel, you can get a decent looking paint job for that and throw it in the garage, and it'll probably last a few more years, but it's just the cheapest route. So then people started using these products more often, the high build polyester urethane or polyester. They have these now. Apparently some of them actually have some flexibility to them, so you really got to check those labels and see what the specs are on it. But and I'm not saying this one does, but there's not a lot of flexibility to it, because it is basically a polyester, which Bondo fillers and stuff like that are also polyesters. And people say this is like spray-on Bondo. Not really. It's a much finer thing than Bondo. That's like saying all Bondos are the same. That's sort of like saying all primers are the same. They're all different. They all have varying adhesion. They all have varying build thickness that you can put on. So when somebody says, "Oh, the epoxy is designed, it adheres to bare metal really well," you better read that label, because it may require a etching primer underneath it, which I didn't even talk about in the beginning. There's also etching primer. All that does is just basic in acid that you put over the metal that is an adhesion promoter for the primer. So these two fillers are both polyester products. Okay, AG47. I'm using this one right now. It's the same thing. It's basically Pro Glaze in a different bottle. But I can tell you that these are completely different. They sand different. They have finer grounds. There's other things in these. I'm not a chemist, so I don't know all the things that they do. But there's even polyester flexible fillers. So people say that all polyester cracks is kind of a farce. You just have to know your products and have tested them and tried them for yourself to know whether what you're going to do works. There's no one way that's right in body work and film. There's no one way. There's 100 different ways. And there's a ton of different ways you can do it however you want, as long as you're using the products correctly and you know the product, what it's going to do and what it's not going to do. Then that helps a lot to know. And how you know that is get those technical data sheets out and start reading them. That's the only way. So over the years, you kind of develop your system of what you're going to do, and it's going to change as time goes on because you're going to find different needs, different things you're trying to, you might think, well, I'm worried about flexibility with this. The panels are kind of weak or whatever that I'm going over. So you're going to choose a urethane primer to go over it. Like the newer cars have thinner metal, so there's more vibration in the metal. So all that stuff started happening, and they came out with these urethane primers. They're not all the same. There's a ton of different urethane primers. This one in particular, Tamco, is a very high build primer. You can put this on almost the same thickness as you can the polyester right here. You can almost do the same thickness. The issue with a lot of them is adhesion. So what they may require is an epoxy primer or an etching primer underneath. There's a ton of different epoxies. You really got to read those labels to make sure that it's going to adhere properly to what you're doing. So what they'll do, some of them will have you put down an epoxy primer as a wet bed. So you can put this down. You can actually, there's a couple different things you can do with the epoxy primer. You can put down epoxy primer as a sealer coat, just throwing metal and stuff that's going to get out in the weather to stop it from rusting, because it is a sealer. There's another thing you can do with the epoxy primer is it can be an adhesion coat. So you put it down and it adheres to the bare metal really well. Most of them do. Some of them don't. Again, read the label. But you put it over the bare metal, and then you can put a urethane high build or one of these polyester primers over it. Or you can put a urethane, this is a non-DTM primer that's a super high build. So some of the higher build ones don't go DTM because the way they're made is they're really made really thick, and you can only get so much in a can. For instance, this company's kind of figured it out. They made a product that has good adhesion, high level adhesion, good encapsulation. So it will actually, they say it's direct to rust even, because it's so good. It's so good at sealing that it actually keeps the rust encapsulated, so that your rust won't keep coming back through the paint. And it's a super high build, and it's also again, it's a true DTM. So some of them will say DTM on it, but if you look at the label, it says, DTM, and it has the limitations on it. So it says recommended for better adhesion, using a adhesion promoter underneath it. So when I'm reading TDSs and I see that it recommends a adhesion promoter underneath, that tells me that that is probably not a really high-end primer. Usually those primers are like less than $100 when you're looking at, a DTM primer, and it says DTM urethane. You go, well, this is DTM urethane, this one's DTM urethane, but they are totally different because the adhesion rate and the build rate, they don't allow you to put a high build on. So a lot of people will tell you, hey, you don't put on urethane primer very thick, and as a general rule, that would probably be a safe thing to say. So what they'll do is they'll put on a urethane primer, or a epoxy primer underneath, and they'll say put on one of these products, or some of them will put this directly on the metal, which some of these are DTM as well. This is the polyester. Some of them are DTM, some aren't. And they'll do that to be able to get a good build to do repairs to the panel, to try and smooth out stuff more than others. So epoxy primer has a lot of different characteristics. There is also epoxy primers that are also a surfacer. Most epoxy primers are just a adhesion coat and a sealer. But there are some, if you read those labels and find out, that are epoxy primer that has a build and it also has a surfacer. For instance, they have a PCL product that is a primer DTM surfacer that is also in epoxy. So, and people go, well, it's not a true epoxy. You know, well, I had it on stuff and left it outside for almost a year and it didn't rust at all. So what is a true epoxy? You know, I don't really know. All I know is what works. So again, the best and safest way to do your body work is always put your filler over bare metal. Some fillers can go over epoxy primers. Some can go over other primers if it's sanded and, you know, heavily sanded. It just depends, again, on what's on the label. But the best and safest way to do your body work is put your filler over bare metal, and then, you know, put down some sort of a DTM product. You can either go with an epoxy or you can go with a urethane DTM that is a true DTM. Or again, if you're going cheap, you can go lacquer. Not recommended, but you can do that. The issues again with lacquer: cracks, it shrinks a lot, it doesn't adhere very well to bare metal. It's okay, it does work. It does have some issues in there. So, you know, if you're going cheap, you're going to get what you pay for. If you want to, you can go with epoxy primer as a adhesion coat, and you can also put down polyester primer over that. You know, you just have to check that label. It has an open time. So your polyester, so some of your epoxies will have an open time where it says you can recoat without sanding within, you know, so many hours or days. I would stick to the hours. I wouldn't go for the days. To me, if you waited overnight, that might, you know, it's all depending on weather, drying time, you know, all that stuff. If you're going to do that, make sure you really kind of do some research and know what you're doing. Because like this car was a urethane or a urethane non-DTM over an epoxy primer. And I did it within that window. I like to wait like an hour. You know, like I said, read that label, make sure it's going to work for the label. And when you do that, it's going to be like kind of sticky just a little bit, but it's going to be dry pretty much all the way through. And if you don't do it right, you could end up with something like wrinkling, where the overcoat starts to pull off the undercoat. So you got to do it in that right time. So there's a couple different systems that people do. They'll do epoxy primer, polyester primer over that, a urethane primer over that, sand it, paint it. Some guys will do a epoxy primer, a high build urethane primer, a really extremely high build urethane primer, and go sand that and actually maybe put multiple coats on there and paint it. And then if you get an extremely good product like Tamco, so like you can get this product here and you can kind of do the one size fits all. You can put it down as a primer. It also has a sealer capabilities. I'm not going to say it's the greatest sealer I've ever used, but it does work as a sealer, as a non-sanded DTM sealer. I'd say an epoxy kind of works a little bit better as a sealer, but this one here is designed to do that as well. And then you can sand it, and you can actually put some polyester glazing over it, just like you do a epoxy. But I really don't recommend that you put on a very thick coat of filler over any primer. So what I typically do myself is I put my filler over the bare metal. And then if I'm going to epoxy prime, I'll epoxy primer. And typically I do that if I'm not going to be painting right away. If I want it sealed, it's going to be outside for a period of time. So, and then what I'll do is I'll put my primer down, and then I will do my guide coat, and then I will use a product like this, which is a finish glaze. I'll use that over it, and usually it's very, very thin amounts of it. And then I'll do all my glazing and make everything look perfect and whatever I'm going to do. And then I will go over that with another coat of urethane primer. So that mid coat could be either the polyester primer or a good high build urethane. There are a difference. The problems you could have with using a non-high build, this is a high build, but a non-high build urethane primer over, that says DTM on it, and you put it on too thick, the problems you can have is delamination of the primer off of the metal. So it's really important that you get a high build, high adhesion primer if you're going to do it this way. This product is designed, again, for that. So like they have some of these other brands that might have, it might even say DTM. This one, I'm glad that they don't put it on DTM, because I've seen products like this say DTM, and they're not really true DTM products. But I think Chameleon kind of has a pretty good reputation of being honest on their labels. Some don't. And, the thing to be leery of, if you're getting a urethane primer and you see it's like under $100, and you're trying to do a high build situation with it, it probably you're going to get, an issue. So, you just kind of read those labels and look and see, and then you'll see stuff like recommended over adhesion promoter. And if you see that, it's not a high build. Don't put it on thick. It's only a 1 coater or 2 coater or whatever. And that's all you can do with that. Like I said, you got to know what this one says. If you read their website, it says it's meant for high build, and it goes on nice and high build, and it doesn't crack like some of the others do. Now, I'm not saying you can do the same thing you can do with this stuff, okay, with the polyester. So if you've got massive waves in your work, or you've got massive stuff, it might be a good idea to use a polyester as a mid coat. And some people say you can't paint over these polyesters. We did it for years, had no issues with adhesion to them. And there was no shrinkage. There was nothing like that. So I don't know, there's guys that say you got to use this as a mid coat, then you got to use urethane over it. That's up to you if you want to do that. If you think you need to, try it, whatever. It's just completely up to you on your method and how you want to do it. But again, we did this for years with just polyester, and then went right over that with paint, and we had no issues with adhesion. In fact, we had this over bare metal and had no issues, again, with like people would say it would rust through. Occasionally that might happen if you're using wet sanding or something like that over this. You really kind of check into that stuff. That's why, again, a lot of people are going with the high build urethanes. That's the reason that you'll see that stuff out there on those forums and things. Is because every product is different, and every product has limitations. And right, so I want you guys to think about your primer like this, like you're building a building, okay? And you don't want the building to fall over. And so if your first coat of adhesion is, your first coat of primer has good adhesion to the metal, as you put more layers and more layers of primer on, this is kind of over exaggerated, or sand it and put another layer on, and then maybe you put polyester coating, glazing over that, and you put another coat of this. So eventually what happens is there's some movement here, right? Because you got this going like this and this going like that, right? as it gets hotter and cooler and hotter and cooler, there's movement that happens, okay? And what you don't want to happen is that first coat to delaminate. So choosing a true DTM on your first part is very important. So trying to get, something that adheres really well. That's why a lot of people like to use an epoxy underneath everything. If it's a really good adhering epoxy, it can help. I'm not saying that that's entirely necessary. In fact, it isn't. In fact, a lot of times I don't use it because I'm using a really good DTM, real true DTM, that actually adheres to bare metal very well. And that's why I said, if you get one that says DTM on it and you're looking at it and it says, for high build, use an epoxy primer or use a adhesion promoter, then that's telling you that when you build off of that and you get a really high build off of that, as it moves back and forth, it may start having issues with the delamination on the undercoat. And their chemists make them with different abilities, and you really need to know what those abilities are, and the only way to do that is sit down and read. Sorry, man. That's just what you got to do if you want to do this kind of thing. So typically, let's kind of summarize it. Your epoxies are for adhesion. Your polyesters are for build. If you're trying to do really straighten out really rough stuff, this does a great job. Disadvantages again can be cracking, and don't use 2 of these in 1 of the gallons. That's where you're gonna have problems. Don't force it dry. I never take this product and put it under heat lamps. I don't do any of that stuff. I let it dry over time, and then you have less issues. If you're trying to get a high build DTM, really again, be skeptical on those labels. And if you're worried, if you're not sure, a good idea is to use an epoxy as a wet bed underneath it. Because again, most epoxies, the typical thing is it's a high adhesion promoter and a sealer that you can put underneath something. It can be just a sealer, or it can be an adhesion promoter for another product that you're going to put over it. Again, depending on the epoxy. There are limitations, and there are a lot of different ones. Or the other thing you can do is go with a high build DTM, true DTM primer like this one that kind of does a lot of all of it. So that's why I like Tamco, is because they do have that product that goes high build, has a great adhesion to bare metal, and it has a decent amount of sealer in it. So it's actually kind of does all of them in one. And, I'm not going to say it does it better than if you use an epoxy primer and then a good high build DTM or non-DTM primer, and then, go over that and, go from there. I'm not going to say it does it better than that. I don't know for sure, but I just know that something like that will work. So it just depends on, like I said, there's a lot of different ways to do this. This is just kind of information to look into. I'm not giving you all the answers because I can't. The only thing I can do is kind of steer you in the direction and let you figure out for yourself what is the best product to use for whatever you're doing. And this kind of gives you some information to look into so that you can start reading those data sheets and figure out what's going to work best for you. So I'll talk to you guys in the next video. Please like, share, and subscribe, and see your comments on that.